Okay, well, welcome everyone to Nature, Key Terms Across Christianity, which is a joint session of the American Society of Church History and the American Catholic Historical Association. I'm Peter Tucson from IUPUI, and I want to thank Anthea Butler and Caleb Maskell and the leadership of the ASCH and ACHA, the rest of the leadership, for organizing this online conference. And I also want to thank Mike Pasquet, who hopefully will be joining us shortly, for conceiving of this session and inviting me to chair it. Our presenters today hail from coast to coast and are zooming in from Washington State, Oregon, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, and Maine. I'm in Indianapolis, which bills itself as the crossroads of America. So I guess that's why Mike asked me to chair this session. We were actually saddened here in Indianapolis this week to learn of the death last Friday of Conrad Cherry, the former director of IUPUI's Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture and former co-editor of our journal, Religion and American Culture. Conrad had retired by the time I arrived at IUPUI, so I never knew him as a colleague, but I certainly knew his work. And I mention it in this session because one of his books published in 1980 was Nature and the Religious Imagination, from Edwards to Bushnell. And I was looking at that book this week and found the following sentence, and I quote Conrad Cherry here: "Nature was a key word in the 18th and 19th centuries, but its superficial qualities of clarity and stability by no means guaranteed it uniformity of meaning or consistency of application." And I think that kind of resonates with the abstract for this session, which, for those of you who are listening, is posted on the ASCH website, because it conveys a similar sense of the instability of the term nature and how it's been or refracted, I should say, through the European Enlightenment, the Christian tradition, and so on. I won't read the whole abstract in the interest of time, but I do think it's worth quoting part of it to help launch our session today. It reads in part: "Our panel proposes that we think more closely and reflectively about the idea of nature in American religious history. How does our study of religion and the environment help us consider the concept of nature in the context of religion? How have scholars up to this point interpreted the role of religion in shaping human understandings of and relationships with nature? What are some blind spots in our understanding of the connections or disconnections between religion and nature in American history and culture? How do our narratives of American religions change when we situate people in natural and built environments? These are just a few ways that we aim to address the topic of nature and speak to an audience interested in both American Catholic history and American church history more broadly. Each panelist will provide a working definition of nature in the attempt to prompt a productive or provocative conversation." And that last part is indeed a provocative challenge, and I don't know how formal a definition each of you wishes to propose, but for those of you listening, get your notebooks ready on that. I do know that each panelist will be discussing a case study from his or her own research, which will certainly inform us about 5 very interesting projects that are sure to make a mark on the field. So with that, let me introduce the 5 panelists very briefly, and I will introduce them in the order in which they appear in the program, after which each panelist will speak for no more than 10 minutes. And as they are speaking, those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A button in Zoom to raise questions or points for discussion. And as time allows in the discussion, I will draw on your questions in moderating the discussion. So to introduce the panelists, first, Richard Chip Callahan teaches at Gonzaga University and is the author of Work and Faith in the Kentucky Coal Fields, Subject to Dust, published by Indiana University Press in 2009. Brett Granger teaches at Villanova University and is the author of Church in the Wild, Evangelicals in Antebellum America, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. Danae Jacobson teaches at Colby College and is working on her first book, which explores the role of Catholic nuns in settler colonialism in the 19th century US West. Michael Pasquet teaches at Louisiana State University and is the author of Fathers on the Frontier, French Missionaries and the Roman Catholic Priesthood in the United States, 1789 to 1870, published by Oxford in 2010, and Religion in America, The Basics, published by Routledge in 2017. Amy Kohlinger teaches at Oregon State University and is the author of The New Nuns, Racial Justice and Religious Reform in the 1960s, published by Harvard in 2007, and Rosaries and Rope Burns, Boxing and Manhood in American Catholicism, 1880 to 1970, under contract with Princeton. And welcome, Mike. As I just said, we are going in the order that you all appear on the program. And so we will begin with this. Oh, you're muted, Shit.
Okay, thank you. And good morning from Gonzaga University on the occupied homelands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians. In July of 1845, American Congregational minister and theologian Horace Bushnell set sail aboard the packet ship Victoria, bound for a year abroad in Europe. Soon to be known for his books Christian Nurture and Nature and the Supernatural, and other works that prepared a path for modern liberal Christian theology, Bushnell was also extremely interested in commerce. One Sunday during his 20-day voyage, he gave a sermon that tied these two interests together, titled A Discourse on the Moral Uses of the Sea. Bushnell presented the sea as a critical material agent in the production of human commerce, morality, and civilization. He said, not a few have wondered why God, in creating a world for habitation of man, should have chosen to hide 3/4 of its surface under the waste of waters. He continued, the fickle domain of waters might as well have been erected into a firm continent of land and covered with flourishing and populous empires. Why then, asked the inquisitive thought of man, why so great a waste in the work of God? Why has he ordained these great oceans and set the habitable parts of the world thus islanded between them? Why spread out these vast regions of waste to suppress the fruitfulness and stint the populousness of his realm? It's a good question. In fact, in another form, it's a question that I've been asking of religious studies for several years, joining with colleagues in other disciplines who've also been developing what's called the blue humanities or blue cultural studies or the new thalassology. For the oceans of the world have indeed been treated by historians, literary critics, and religious studies scholars alike as empty and wasted spaces between the populated land masses that really matter. This is what maritime historian Marcus Rediker has termed Pterocentrism. The oceanic turn, in contrast, foregrounds the sea and offers another way of seeing humans in relation to non-human beings and materialities. It pushes us to think beyond the boundaries that we so often take for granted, be they national boundaries, boundaries between the land and sea, or boundaries between human and other than human histories, and to see the ways that religion informs and is informed by the varied and dynamic constructions of these boundaries. This goes beyond the treatments of, say, Atlantic world studies that attend to the sea primarily as a surface connecting units of land. This morning, I want to take Bushnell's sermon as a jumping off point to reflect on the absence of the ocean in American religious studies and to start to bring an oceanic horizon into some sort of focus. So what is the purpose of the sea, according to Bushnell's theological understanding? He first distinguished the moral uses of the sea from the practical elements that what he called a natural philosopher or a scientist would focus on, such as the sea's tempering of the land's climate, the sea as a great storehouse of provisions and things like that. These things, he says, God didn't need the sea for. He could have done this on his own if he wanted to. So the reason God created the sea lies in its moral uses or its purposes for advancing human morality. Note the dematerializing move to abstraction that defines the sea's particularly religious significance. The moral use of the sea had at least three aspects. First, it was a natural boundary between kingdoms and nations, allowing each to develop rather than be at constant warfare. Second, the sea kept one part of the world separate from other parts, in Bushnell's words, quote, preserving it for discovery and occupation at an advanced period of history, unquote, which would spur older civilizations to renewal, reform, and improvement, as when Europeans arrived in the Americas, and then, quote, man was called out, as it were, to begin again, unquote. Finally, the sea was also a connecting power, quote, bringing all regions and climes into correspondence and commercial exchange, unquote, creating a kind of cosmopolitanism. Bushnell spent much of his sermon elaborating this last point, the cosmopolitan role of commerce over the sea, connecting disparate peoples and advancing morality. He wrote, quote, "The nations engaged in commerce will, of course, be the most forward nations, for the man of commerce is never a bigot. He goes to buy in other nations commodities that he wanted in his own. He is therefore in the habit of valuing what is valuable in other countries, and so proportionally are the people or nations that consume the commodities of other countries. In the meantime, the nations most forward in art and civilization are approaching by the almost omnipresent commerce they maintain all the rude and barbarous nations of the world, carrying with them wherever they go all those signs of precedence by which these nations may impress with a sense of their backwardness, and set forward in a career of improvement." So commerce across the expanses of the sea that connect otherwise disparate nations was to Bushnell the handmaiden of religion, he called it, forging the infrastructures and clearing the grounds through which Christianity would be spread around the world. Bushnell was not the only American writer to take up the relationship between the sea and commerce and Christianity in the 19th century. For instance, Presbyterian William Aikman's 1863 book, The Moral Power of the Sea, took up similar themes in more detail, providing a comprehensive history of the oceanic commerce that spread, quote, "an awakened civilization and a genuine Christianity around the world." In another vein, Alexander Starbuck, in his monumental 1878 book, The History of the American Whale Fishery from its inception to 1876, wrote, quote, "It may be safely alleged that but for whalers, the Western oceans would much longer have been comparatively unknown, and into the fields opened by them flowed the trade of the civilized world. In their footsteps followed Christianity. They introduced the missionary to new spheres of usefulness and made his presence tenable," unquote. In fact, at the time that Bushnell presented his sermon in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the American whaling industry was the 5th largest segment of the American economy. There were, in July of 1845, easily over 400 American whaling ships plying the world's oceans. Bushnell emphasized commerce, a kind of surface engagement with the ocean, commerce happening across the ocean's surfaces. And the whaling industry certainly played a role in global commerce. But whaling also drew attention to another aspect of the ocean, its living depths, a space of complex relations between human and non-human beings, and a space of natural resource extraction. Whereas Bushnell differentiated this element of the sea from its religious significance, which took place on the surface, I think it's worth calling attention to the sea as a source of life that lay behind that commerce. I want to use Bushnell's sermon as an occasion not only to call attention to the sea as a crucial and critical, though often ignored aspect of American religion, but also to call out Bushnell's presentation of both the sea and of the Christian civilization that it makes possible and expands as abstractions that obscure the necessity of natural resource extraction to the material conditions of the possibility of that desired reality. Not that Bushnell would have denied the realities and importance of fisheries, including the whale fishery. However, his language moves away from the human dependence on natural resources and the human labor of resource extraction as something relevant to thinking about this Christian civilization that he joyfully promoted. The language of civilization, a language used to describe Anglo-Christian American supremacy, a language used to signify what indigenous peoples lacked, is a complicated language, sometimes used to refer to moral values, sometimes to governance and social ethical systems, usually entailing some sort of progressive evolutionary framework. But how did people tell the uncivilized from the civilized? What did it mean to recognize civilization? Civilization was not only about moral behavior, but also material practice. Clean burning streetlights and lamps, the high fashion of corsets, perfumes, and soaps, the industrial technologies of textile and other manufacturing, smooth riding carriage suspensions. These, all products derived from whales, were the markers of civilization. They mark materially in high relief the signs of civilization versus savagery, especially during the Victorian period. Note that this was also a time in the US and Canada when Christian missionaries were actively working to civilize indigenous American communities, in large part through transforming their material cultures toward Western forms of dress, hairstyle, foodways, housing, and agricultural training. So the concept of nature is bound up in this civilizing process, signified by civilization's desire for liberation from dependency on nature's forces, a central theme carried over from the Enlightenment, and for the transformation of the world into human-created, human-dominated art, fashion, and invention. The civilized human world is, by definition, nature's other, or an attempt to imagine itself as nature's other. In the 19th century, as I've already suggested, a key element of making this desired civilization a material reality was the extraction of oil and bone from whales. Without whale hunting, the civilization that Bushnell and Aikman and Starbuck and so many others had in mind when they talked about a way of life intimately linked to Christianity that they desired to spread throughout the world would not exist. Certainly, there may have been other models, other figurations and materializations of something called Christian civilization that would have emerged, but the one that did emerge and shaped the 19th century depended upon whales. What if we paid more attention to this fact in the study of religion, to the way that the products and labors of the sea were foundational requirements for the conditions of possibility of the Christian civilization and the civilizational desires that people like Bushnell promoted? If I had more time, I would begin to outline the place of whales in American religious history, from the Pilgrims' thrill of finding an abundance of whales in what is now known as Massachusetts Bay, prompting them to stay there, to the importance of drift whales to the economies of coastal American colonies and to the payment of pastors from New England down through what is now New York and New Jersey, to the ways that competition over the rights to whale carcasses, access to waterfront, and whale processing labor was critical to the interactions between British colonists and indigenous peoples along the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic coasts, the Shinnecock and Wampanoag in particular. I would discuss the religious innovations created to minister and evangelize to whaling crews as they extended their voyages through the Atlantic and into the Pacific and Indian Oceans, voyages that lasted for an average of 3 to 4 years and brought their crews into religious interactions and exchanges with indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands. I would mention that the American colonization of Hawaii and the Latter-day Saints missionization of the Pacific Islands were the results of the whaling industry. I would explore the relationship between the transformations of the Makah people of Washington's Olympic Peninsula from a whale-centered culture and ceremonial system to wage labor, and the ways that missionary practices of Christian civilizing that caused that transformation were aided by the American commercial whaling industry's hunting of the gray whale to near extinction. And I would reflect on the radical ontological and epistemological differences between Christian America's relationship to whales and that of the Makah or the Shinnecock, and how that religious history, because it is a religious history, reverberates today. But because I don't have the time, I will again suggest that what I'm getting at, finally, especially as we think about what religious studies means in the age of the Anthropocene, is that we would do well and find much to think about if we attended more directly and intentionally to the basic work of the transformation of nature into culture, for lack of better terms, and the way that is reflected or obscured in the doctrinal, theological, and practical expressions of religious cultures. I'll give a nod toward Darren Jochuk's recent and Judith Brunton's current work on oil fields, and Kristen Nabin-Warren's and Johanna Smith's current work on slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants as examples of scholars of religion attending to these basic sites of extraction and processing of raw materials of modern American and Canadian life. These really are the first things from which worlds are built, and how human communities represent, reflect on, and relate to this process is a subject ripe for the study of American religious pasts, presents, and futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Chip. Hello to my co-panelists. I want to offer some historiographical reflections on the study of Christianity and nature that come out of my work as a cultural historian of the 19th century. These reflections focus on the taxonomies that we use, both implicitly and explicitly as scholars of religion, to frame and to understand our subjects. Now, it seems like it's impossible to think about a field like nature and religion without automatically conjuring up some of these taxonomies, right? We're really familiar with these ones, the natural and the supernatural, nature and culture. We just heard from also human versus non-human nature, right? These are the very familiar standard taxonomies that we come up against all the time. I want to look at two others that are, I think, particularly relevant to a panel that's focused on bringing together Catholic and Protestant attitudes to nature and religion. And this would be romantic and revivalist, or another way to code this would be liberal and conservative. Again, speaking of the more implicit ways that we read these. So revivalism and romanticism. And then the category of Protestant absence and Catholic presence, which I'll also extend to notions of indigenous presences in the natural world. Okay, so first with definitions, because we're all asked to do some definitions. So what's nature, right? A great many things, it turns out. A.O. Lovejoy identified 66 different senses of the word nature and natural in literature and philosophy, right up until the 18th century in the West. Raymond Williams whittled it down to three main uses of the word in English. So I'll just throw those out here. The first sense of nature refers to the collective phenomena of the physical world, including animals, plants, landscapes, other features of material existence, animate and inanimate, beyond the control of human nature, of human culture rather. So that's that division. Taken as a whole, nature is an abstraction, a singular name, writes Williams, for the real multiplicity of things and living processes. A second sense of nature refers to a quality, right? The basic, essential, or given features of a person or a thing. This is probably the oldest, the oldest sense in the English language of nature, and it's worth pausing here, I think, to note that the Latin word natura inherited some of the associations of the Greek word cosmos, order or world, right? While adding a powerful link with origins, biological origins. So natura comes from the root nasci. I don't have any Latin, I might have butchered that. So nasci means to be born, okay? So natura and nasci, to be born. So therefore, the Western conception of nature is etymologically linked to a number of related words, including nascent, innate, native, and nation. Okay, so this link between nature and the sense of innate characteristics, biological origins, and communal or national belonging became a powerful feature of racial imaginaries, including white supremacy. So that's number two. The third definition of nature that Williams outlines indicates something quite different, okay? This is the belief in an immanent physical and or spiritual force considered to be the underlying cause of physical phenomenon, all right? So this sense conveyed in sayings such as like nature teaches that so-and-so, or nature abhors a vacuum, right? This communicates some of this idea of a personal or an impersonal reality, right? Some realities often thought of as an energy or a vital force that's pervading matter, or as this alternately as a set of laws that govern the physical relation between things. Okay, so this is the third sense of nature. Williams argues that the emergence in Western culture of a singular, abstracted, and personified nature, often capitalized, right, as it is, was equal in significance to the development of monotheism, for which it often functions as a kind of surrogate, right? Okay, so the last definition raises attention from me. Namely, it suggests that much of what we mean by nature, in fact, refers to another kind of reality that we often describe using words like supernatural, right, or spirit, okay? The natural in this sense connotes not only visible realities, but invisible ones as well, not simply concrete bits and pieces, but also speculative abstractions and personified wholes. And since I've already started to fuzzy the sacred taxonomy of supernatural and natural, let me say outright, we all know there are two kinds of historians. There are the splitters and there are the lumpers, right? Today I'm going to be a lumper. And I want to raise two taxonomies here that I think need to be troubled when it comes to discussions about Christianity and nature and American religion. The first, as I've said already, is Romanticism and Revivalism, or what often gets behind that is a certain deployment of liberal and conservative or elite and popular religion. And the second is as I've said, notions of Protestant absence and Catholic presence, which often get extended to indigenous religions. For my last project, I focused on a study of evangelical nature mysticism. I took this on because it was highly counterintuitive. Everybody knows that an evangelical mystic is an oxymoron. To a large extent, the study of religion and nature in America is still governed by the cliche of liberal romantics and conservative revivalists. It's Emerson versus Finney, fight to the death. The book of nature versus the book of scripture, an immanent spirituality versus a kind of world-hating spiritual escapism. The problem, and I say this as a historian of 19th century America, is that the revivalists that I met in my archives were besotted by the natural world. They couldn't stop themselves. And this was so, I discovered, not because they were reading Wordsworth or Emerson, but because they had access to cheap reprints of Puritan devotional manuals, like Richard Baxter's The Saints' Everlasting Rest. And because they took seriously Baxter's instruction to his readers to turn every moment and every physical environment into an opportunity for heavenly contemplation, in order to have a taste of heaven here below. When we speak of liberal romantics and conservative revivalists, we need to be aware of another taxonomy that we invoke, whether we realize it or not. I'm speaking here of the pairing of mysticism and its twin specter, enthusiasm. Mysticism is what white people do to become gods. It's good religion. It's inclusive. It's universal. Enthusiasm is what poor white people and Black people do. It's syncretistic, it's fanatical, it's dangerous, it's bad juju. So I think we still need to get beyond this cliche of romantic and revivalist mysticism and enthusiasm. A second cliche, or a second taxonomy here, when speaking of practices such as the contemplation of the natural world, we, I think as a field, still need to get beyond the taxonomy of Catholic presence and Protestant absence. Namely, the belief that Catholics uniquely inhabit a world full of spirits, while Protestants inhabit a disenchanted universe, which they've made safe from the spiritual world. I understand there are powerful traditions of theological reflection that sought to decouple matter from spirit in the Eucharist, for example. I also think that if you look only at what Protestants say and not at what they do, you only get half the picture. What we have in the case of Protestants is, I think, often a powerful theological rhetoric of absence, coupled with practices aimed at cultivating a powerful sense of the immediate presence of God, which, by the way, is Bernie McGinn's definition of mysticism. Of course, this sense of presence is figured rather differently in Protestantism than in Catholicism. Rather than Mary or the saints, it's typically the Holy Spirit or Jesus or even God the Father. But in the case of the various movements of heart religion that emerged from German pietism in the 17th century and rolled down through Methodism and Pentecostalism, we actually see a ratcheting up of concern with the cultivation of presence. So the notion of Martin Luther's repudiation of transubstantiation, that somehow this sets off the disenchantment of the world, especially as spiritual, for our purposes today, the spiritual potentialities of nature, I think this needs to be really, really dismissed. So that's the second taxonomy that I want to trouble in relation to the way historians and scholars of religion think about religion and nature, particularly in my period, I think, but also in others, Catholic presence and Protestant absence. But it's important to note that another version of this taxonomy, as it has shaped the writing of American religious history, and it builds off the first. And this is Protestant absence in relation to indigenous and more broadly non-white notions of sacred presence. All right, so an instance of this. The historian James Merrill, in his Bancroft Prize-winning work, Into the American Woods, Negotiators on the Pennsylvania Frontier, describes what he calls the, quote, deeply spiritual nature of Indian travel through the woods, showing how for the Iroquois and other Native American groups, all of nature, rocks, rivers, trees, mountains, was alive with spirits. The woods, he writes, were, quote, an enchanted realm, a land of opportunity, but also of peril, end quote. As a case in point, Merrill describes how one group of Indians named a spot on the Susquehanna River Ponk Utanink, or the town of the Ponkies. The Ponkies were tiny insects known for their ferocious bites. And these ponkies were believed to have been created from the dust and ashes of a vanquished sorcerer. Merrill's careful retrieval of Native American attitudes and practices contrasts with his rather flat depiction of the 18th century European colonist. Unlike the enchanted Indian, he writes, quote, "To a Pennsylvania traveler, snow and rain simply fell. Toads merely croaked. Bugs just bit," end quote. This description just isn't good enough. For German and English Protestants tramping around the middle colonies, all of nature, both animate and inanimate, was endowed with spiritual power, danger, and possibility. In my own work, I set Merrill's rich characterization of indigenous practice and presence in tension with that of Methodist itinerants, such as Thomas Coke. For Coke, devotion to Christ was advanced through mystical communion with the natural world, one instance being his frequent practice of praying daily in the woods. In one scene in his journals, he wrote, "It is one of my most delicate entertainments to embrace every opportunity of engulfing myself, if I may so express it, in the woods. I seem then to be detached from everything but the quiet vegetable creation and my God," end quote. For Coke, in other words, union with Christ was advanced through union with creation. But if contemplation held pleasures, snares abounded. A few weeks later, Coke wrote, "The ticks," this is a quote, "the ticks indeed, which are innumerable, are a little troublesome," end quote. With rising distress, he described their effects on his body. Quote, "They burrow in the flesh and raise pimples, which sometimes are quite alarming and look like the effects of a very disagreeable disorder," end quote. Rather than abandon his habit, however, Coke made his suffering the object of meditation. The pain, he wrote, was inconsequential, quote, opposed to his affection for the Lord. To put it simply, to argue as Merrill does that bugs just bit European Americans doesn't begin to account for their experience of the natural world, which in many ways, in the case of Coke and others, finds echoes in early modern Catholic devotional life, right? All right, so I just want to say clearly that this rejection, right, of the cliche of Protestant disenchantment is not to celebrate it or to valorize it, nor to see it as a resource, a simple resource in the cultivation of an ecological sensibility, right? Unlike for the early Romantics, nature was not for evangelicals simply a site of spiritual rejuvenation. It was clearly, in the case of Coke and others, a site of spiritual temptation, of trial, of testing, right? Seeing nature as a site and a source of spiritual experience did nothing to slow their instrumentalization of that very world, right? And the divine presence they experienced there was fleeting. Presence and absence rather worked together in a kind of oscillating tension. And we do better here, I think, rather than opposing these categories, to see an accommodation here, an ongoing kind of accommodation, both in Catholic and in Protestant devotion. Much as we should, I think, avoid juxtaposing sacramental and instrumental approaches to the natural world. Often when it comes to lived religion, these are two sides of the same coin. All right, I'm basically done. I just want to say in closing that the point of lumping here today for me isn't to efface difference. It's not to deny change over time or any of that. It's to say that the basis on which we often assign differences may be faulty or arbitrary or just simply unhelpful to the purposes of understanding our subjects. And in place of these taxonomies, I'm going to suggest that we start to highlight some oscillating tensions within these traditions. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Britt. Danae?
Thank you. I'm glad we'll have time to talk at the end because I have lots of thoughts to interact with you all. Hello from Wabanaki territory. I'm at Colby College in Maine. I don't think I prepared a very explicit definition of nature, but hopefully by the end there'll be something implicit there. So as I prepared for this conversation this week, two other tasks were also shaping my thinking. I've simultaneously been preparing for the spring term, which here starts next week, and I'll be teaching a seminar on US environmental history. And at the same time, I've been struggling and working hard to keep my head in my own research and writing, which I'm sure you all can appreciate that tension. I think unlike most of you on this panel, I'm not affiliated with a religious studies department in any way. My primary home is the history department. I teach courses on environmental history, US Empire, US West, first half of the US survey. Yet my own research and my current book project focuses on 19th century nuns, as Peter was saying, who set up missions in the 19th century in the US West. So in my research, I'm constantly asking sort of a variation on the questions we posed for this panel, which is sort of what do nature, the environment, and religion have to say to one another in these fields? And it's a question I've wrestled with for a long time throughout graduate school and up until now. And two kind of just anecdotes of this. When I first started my research, I was inquiring at a lot of archives of women religious and about whether they had any sort of sources that were environmentally linked or adjacent or, and the answer was always no, we have nothing like that, nothing related to environmental history. And then I would go and find, indeed, there were many rich sources. And so that was interesting to me, that's not how people were thinking about these archives. And then kind of on the opposite side, I found myself, my sort of institutional homes are environmental history, Western History Association. So I'm often at the Environmental History Conference, and often my panel has been the only one on religion. Several times in recent years, I've done searches actually in the program. The word religion doesn't appear in the program. It's not really a common category of analysis in those spaces. There are exceptions, but that's kind of the norm. So I often find myself in these spaces of translation. So I'm very eager for this conversation because in a way it really brings together two scholarly worlds for me. So I just am excited to be here. So by way of getting at some of the theoretical historiographic kind of conversations that we've posed for this roundtable, I'm going to give you just a really brief example from my work and then sort of zoom back out and sort of reflect upon what I think are some of the conclusions we can draw. So over the winter break, I've been working on an article. And the article is about Catholic nuns who went on what they call these begging tours from gold miners right after the gold rush started in Montana Territory in the 1860s. And it's fascinating for all sorts of reasons that I don't have time to go into now. But if you can just picture, right, these women in these 19th century women in these habits, Catholic women going into these very male-dominated spaces, asking them for money. It's an interesting picture. So, but what I want to talk about today is how, and what I show in this article is how environmental history helps us understand the nuns' actions and their labor in a whole different way. And so for the nuns' part, and this is most, from their records, they understood and interpreted what they were doing in begging for miners as labor, but primarily they saw it as spiritual sacrifice. And this is how they describe these tours again and again, as sacrifice and in spiritual terms. They describe, quote, the act of begging as always repugnant to nature and ever humiliating. They describe it, another description is, quote, we have the great fatigues attached to traveling nearly always on horseback. One can recall difficult roads, at times perilous dangers in the mountains, the places where we must lodge with total strangers, trusting their honesty and propriety without knowing them. All these are difficulties through which we passed. That's the end of that quote. So their willingness to humble themselves in a way that they recognized and named as humiliating, demonstrated to the miners and to themselves their own sort of spiritual mettle. Their work was worthy if they were willing to humiliate themselves and sacrifice in such obvious ways. So the nuns understood the challenges that they faced in the mining camps and on the journey to the mining camps as sacrifice that both purified them individually, but also in a broader sense consecrated their labors in the West. So they had just arrived in the West, in Montana in the 1860s. And we could go into, the sort of deep history of thinking about sacrifice in Catholic thought, but I won't do that now. The point though is that the challenges, whether the humiliation of begging, the limited access to the sacraments, which they talked about a lot, or the very physical challenges of these begging tours. All of this had spiritual value in their, from their perspective. So in addition to this interpretation, their lives and labors were deeply implicated and rooted in the mining boom in the region, the establishment of the Flathead Indian Reservation in this time, other settler colonial efforts, and the environment of the Rocky Mountains in the 1860s. And so what I've been actually really reflecting on this week is how, if I didn't ask these questions that were sort of prompted by my training in environmental history of these archives, I wouldn't be able to see some of these broader connections. So I'm just going to give you two very, very brief examples from this article. So one is just a sort of very literal, but the way that the environment directly affected their begging labor. So the weather, the terrain, the climate, the geology of the Bitterroot Mountains shaped the distances that nuns could go, their mode of travel, often on horseback, and when they could go. So for example, in 1871, the nuns noted, quote, "The mines were less fruitful than formerly, so donations decreased. We had decided to go to another place, but were told that these miners had been delayed by spring rains and floods and had just begun to work. So we decided to return to the mission and wait more favorable times." Here, and that's the end of the quote. Here, the weather directly affected the fruitfulness of the mines and thus the level of success possible on their begging tours. And their language indicates sort of that they saw mining as kind of a harvest from the land. And there's a deep history of, of viewing the land that way that is important to talk about. And just the terrain of the Rocky Mountains, the travel, the uncertainty of the weather, all these things shaped when they traveled, how long they stayed out, and where they were able to go. A second example, again, just sort of racing through this, but I'm trying to keep our time in mind, is that the nuns' views of the land itself and of nature more broadly is a really important part of the story. So they saw the landscape as a part of the challenge that they faced in their labors, right? So one description of a begging journey reads this way: "Our people advance into the depth of the forest and the most precipitous mountains. Apart from encountering a few miners here and there, nothing came to trouble their solitude. And when night came, despite their hunger and weariness, everyone set to work." So in this account, the nuns are both intrepid explorers who advanced into the steep mountains and deep forests, as well as laborers who persisted despite the endless tasks before them. In this telling, the landscape itself demands the nuns' sacrifice and bravery because of its arduous and assumed untamed character. And there's also a hint here, and I don't really have time to go into it, but elsewhere, that the nuns' labors and even their presence, specifically as white women, could help civilize these spaces, and that the land itself was part of the problem. So these are just two tiny examples from what I've just been working on these last few weeks, how I consider the relationship between religion and nature. So in this particular story, factors like weather, geography, climate significantly shape the kinds of labor that nuns did, the ways that they sustain themselves. So begging is only possible because of the very particular geology in this region, and how they built and constructed landscapes in the West. But I'm also really interested in the interplay of the limits and possibilities that specific ecologies offer and the meanings that various groups of people make of that, including nuns. Ideas about nature radically affected nuns' experience of the West, how they framed their own identities and labors, and their relationships to other people, such as New Mexicans, indigenous people, miners, as well as to wider systems like the federal government. So in conclusion, I want to zoom out for just one quick minute and just reflect on sort of these fields, for me, of environmental history, religious studies. When we bring them together, I think this shifts the conversation in several important ways. And I really welcome hearing your reflections too on other ideas of ways that this can shift the conversation. But from my view, a story that is often told especially the 19th century story, as Catholic hagiography or as pioneers conquering great challenges. It can now be told and incorporated into a larger, more critical national and or religious story. Within the particular, the Catholic story, nuns become much more complex than just, as they're often characterized, just sort of assumed to be partners of the priests and exactly the same as priests, or just not acknowledged. It actually meant something quite different for a nun to go begging in a mine than it did for a priest, right? And not just, that's also deeply gendered, but it is linked to how they saw the land and ideas about the land and who should be traveling through on horseback and who shouldn't be, and who should be doing what kinds of labor in the 19th century. So that's actually a different story than what priests are doing. So another sort of shift, I think, in these conversations is it really integrates US religious history. So we begin to see how spiritual labor intersects and melds together with other kinds of labor, other kinds of developments in the 19th century, things like building the Continental Empire, and indigenous dispossession, the growth of the federal government in the West. These like really big themes of the 19th century. Suddenly, these Roman Catholic nuns are a part of that story, and we begin to be able to draw some of those connections. And then finally, in the fields of Western history and environmental history, which is where I spend most of my days, it also contributes. So it goes both ways. And by bringing in new subjects that are generally not considered, I think what happens is that the story of settler colonialism, westward expansion, and also the environmental story that's a part of that, it becomes a more religious story. But it's not just adding religion for its own sake. It's not the old adage of just add and stir. It also illumines a new kind of colonialism, I think. The scholar Alyosha Goldstein has described, and this is a quote, rather than a decisive narrative of domination and resistance, dynamics of power under colonial rule have often been complicated by discrepant alliances, the aspirations of elites, and social antagonisms that precede and exceed the colonial situation. That's the end of the quote. I think bringing religious subjects to these fields helps us move toward messier kinds of stories, this kind of thing that Goldstein is gesturing towards, where a story where nuns who were marginalized in their own church hierarchy as women and as Catholics in the US National Project at the time, they were also shaping and participating in colonialism and environmental change of the 19th century. And that's a really interesting story, right? I just want to thank you all. This panel has been a really great opportunity for me to sort of delve back into sort of these higher level conversations that really are at the heart of my own work. And it's been a good reminder that as I'm working on my, my begging article and my environmental history seminar, that they are connected. And actually analytically really significant to one another. So there's a ton more to say, but I'll stop there, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Danae. Mike, you're next.
Can everybody see the slide?
Yes.
All right. So remember this picture of this serpent river monster. So James Buchanan Eads engineered and constructed the first large span bridge across the Mississippi River in St. Louis in 1874. And he later completed a jetty project at the mouth of the Mississippi, seen here, in 1879. He was a big man who built big things on behalf of the big state. He once vowed, quote, to undertake the work of opening the mouth of the Mississippi with a faith based upon the ever constant ordinances of God himself. And I will give to the Mississippi River through his grace and by application of his laws, a deep, open, safe, and permanent outlet to the sea. Fast forward to 1927, the year of the Great Flood, the year that the country's levees-only policy for flood control failed utterly. It was an event described by Herbert Hoover as the greatest peacetime calamity in the history of the country. 26,000 square miles of land inundated, almost 1 million refugees, $400 million in damage, around 500 fatalities. Politicians, engineers, soldiers, citizens, they all wondered, what the hell do we do with this river, this monster that we've created? Writing in the National Geographic in 1927, Frederick Simpich wondered, perhaps perfect defense can never be, for levees are against nature, always using a capital N, by the way. But man persists, like the ant whose hill is plowed. He pays for thwarting nature's laws when he feels the prize is worth the price. So the war was on. And the only man capable of taking on this tattooed, bearded giant seen here on the left, representing the Mississippi, was Uncle Sam. And on the right, following closely behind the receding waters, was the return of nature. This fair woman in a summer dress, bearing, as you can see here, the fruits of southern soil to our farmers. The Mississippi River Flood Control Association published a picture book memorializing the flood of 1927. And it begins with this photo. It's the first photo in the album. Imagined as a vision of the Delta when nature smiles. A reminder that the last line there, the Delta is a national asset worth saving. Paying no mind to the unsmiling faces framed in a cotton field. This is the state's nature smiling. This is why it was and always will be worth fighting the Mississippi. So Congress acted swiftly, first with the Flood Control Act of 1928, followed by a second act, a more comprehensive one in 1936. And it was decided the federalization of flood control was law. The state would take full responsibility for taming this menace to national welfare. And the state's instrument for taming the Mississippi was the Army Corps of Engineers. This body of soldiers and civilians, most of them men, have done the work of engineering the Mississippi ever since, even before, in fact. John McPhee, who I suspect some of you are familiar with, describes the Corps as only he can in his incredible book, The Control of Nature. So I'm going to read it real quick because I love it. In addition to all the things the Corps actually does and does not do, there are infinite actions it is imagined to do, infinite actions it is imagined not to do, and infinite actions it is imagined to be capable of doing, because the Corps has been conceded the almighty role of God. And it follows then that the task of the Corps as the instrument of the state is not just to control nature, but to conquer it. Because as McPhee says, nature in this place has become the enemy of the state. And here, I think it's a good time to consider the evolution. And it's not a point-to-point evolution, but I'm just going to describe it that way, of how men have imagined. And I say men intentionally. I hope everybody hears that and recognizes that. Have imagined the Mississippi, in this case, white Christian American men, most of them Protestant, some of them Catholic. From James Eads back in the 19th century, expressing wonder at God's creation, God's nature, God's gift to man, man's responsibility to apply God's laws of nature to make this valley of the Mississippi a haven for Christendom, for America. To today, where sure, we sometimes, I think, we'll get people talking about the river and nature and God in similar kinds of terms. But if you spend time with the living and dead members of the Army Corps of Engineers, which I have done and continue to do, you're likely not to meet this white Christian American man or men who are more attuned to what they can't quite articulate it usually, but it's there, a kind of divorce that they're aware of between God, man, and nature. And while this impulse, indeed this compulsion to control nature and defy God by extension, is not unique to the United States. It does come with a white Christian ring to it, typically though one muted by Christianity's ability to blend into the secular and the secular state. So I want to end by looking at how the flood of 2011 plays a part in helping us trying to understand this, what I would loosely call this divorce between this sort of trinity of God, nature, and man, or state. It was on display in 2011, which at the time it brought many comparisons to 1927. It did not lead to the incredible inundation that you see here on the left, which is probably why you didn't hear quite so much about it. The designed flood worked in this case. Their ability to control the waters, they were successful. And always using this martial language of war and fight. In fact, whenever any kind of a major flood starts, it's in their policy statement, in their policy, in their operational manuals, it's called a flood fight. The flood fight is on. But in the Corps' official history of the flood of 2011, we have this book here entitled Divine Providence, which is so weird, I'll have to admit. But it's a kind of nod to the belief that disasters are natural, right? They are divine providence. Of course, environmental historians and historians generally, and I think if you push people a little bit, they'll recognize that there's no such thing as a natural disaster because people be people, right? But if you read this book and go through it, and you go through the Corps' records and you talk to the men who worked the flood fight of 2011, you get this admission, in this case by Steve Gambrell. He's the executive director of the Mississippi River Commission, when he had to give the order to blow up the fuse plug levee at Birds Point, New Madrid, which is near the intersection of Illinois and Missouri. And I won't read the whole thing to you, or maybe I will. You can skim it. What he's doing here is he is acknowledging that what they have done is their failure, right? As successful as they were to control nature, they still fail people, and they fail themselves. They're talking to God, not to, as nature or to control the river. They're doing the controlling. It's to the people who are affected by this designed flood that will end up harming people's livelihoods. And this kind of divorce, as I loosely describe it, is to say that people like Gambrell and the men and women who work for the Army Corps know the Mississippi River probably better than anyone that I've ever met. Probably, I'll stand by that. And this kind of human moment in the control of nature is something that McPhee didn't get into. But he was a writer, and he was kind of going for that amazing quote that I gave you. But as we start to look a little bit closer, we can get to something that Harold Pinter says, because he's someone who studies religion and rivers. No, he really doesn't. But I do take to heart this line, and I'll end with it. For if and when we talk of a river, we talk of a deep and dank architecture, one that spans incredible sweeps of time, and one that I think confounds our understanding of this relationship between people, land, and water, God, river, and state.
Thank you, Mike. Amy?
I'm just sharing my screen. There we go. It's good to see everyone here, and thanks especially to Mike for organizing this panel. I know in our proposal, we promised to each offer a working definition of nature, but I'm going to be the contrarian here and resist. Definitions of nature often create a sui generis category of specialness that reproduces many of the problems we're currently trying to purge from the field of religious studies and our definitions of religion. So I'm not going to go down that road. A better approach, I think, is simply to ground one's analysis of intersections of nature and religion in a processual or functional model, to avoid reifying nature as an object by instead examining what it does, how it interacts, how it speaks, what effect it has. Framed in terms of the 19th century tension between Emerson and Muir, to define nature is to join Ralph Waldo Emerson in viewing nature as a unified object to be studied because of its utility to the Anthropocene. And I think we've moved beyond that, hopefully, as a culture. Instead, I want to urge us to lean into John Muir's ecstatic and experiential approach to nature as a zone of possibility for humans to encounter non-human entities and forms, geology, hydrology, flora and fauna, and maybe somewhere in there the divine as well. To approach nature as a phenomenological playground for the possibility of intersubjective encounters that transform us. In my comments, I want to explore intersections of religion and nature at the National Sanctuary of the Sorrowful Mother, also known as the Grotto in Portland, Oregon. It's a 100-year-old Marian shrine hidden in Southeast Portland, where nature and religion intersect to produce what I'm going to call the experience of sanctuary. Now recall that the term sanctuary describes the part of a church which contains the high altar. So a sanctuary is by definition a holy place, as in, be sure to remove your hat as you enter the sanctuary. But in ecological terms, the word sanctuary also describes a refuge or a place of safety for wildlife and perhaps people, as in no hunting on the grounds of the wildlife sanctuary, or also this city provides sanctuary to immigrants facing deportation by ICE. The term sanctuary then has a polyvocal ability to communicate both sacredness and safety, religion and refuge. And that's what makes it an apt term for the grotto. Tucked away on a busy side street of a congested block that boasts multiple marijuana dispensaries and strip clubs, the grotto includes 62 acres of pine woodlands, gardens, statuary, walking paths, 2 chapels, a monastery, and of course a gift shop. The grotto is divided between upper and lower levels with a modest elevator. And I love the elevator here on the cliff, and with a modest elevator that takes visitors from the lower level constellation of the original grotto up a 110-foot basalt cliff to the broad expanse of fir forests, flower gardens, and meditations that comprise the upper level. The Order of the Servants of Mary, or the Servites, who founded the National Sanctuary of the Sorrowful Mother in 1923, and who maintain a monastery and a personal presence at the grotto, have been quite skillful in making the grotto an inviting place, even and maybe even especially for people who are not inclined toward organized religion. In the unique religious landscape of Oregon, where the nuns are by far the largest demographic group, in a cultural climate suspicious of traditional religious institutions and practices, the Servites have achieved a noteworthy detente with the hipsters, skeptics, and panentheists of Portland. The grotto is a destination for Catholics, especially Catholics from South Asia who make pilgrimages here from throughout the Pacific Northwest. It's a popular stop for tourists making the rounds of Portland's abundant gardens. But the Servites orient their main ministry toward making the grotto a welcoming place, a sanctuary for average religion-adverse Oregonians. The fleece-clad nature lovers who walk the grotto's meditation labyrinth, the tattooed seekers who pause to photograph tall trees against the sky. The Servites are adept at translating Catholic religiosity into idioms of nature, wellness, and interconnectivity that appeal broadly in the Pacific Northwest and that don't trigger religious skeptics into panic about conversion. The grotto's website and social media sites, brochures, and pamphlets all feature the motto, "A place for everyone." You are welcome here, one of the main entrance signs encourages. Welcome in this holy, quiet place where God's love is reflected in the beauty of his creation and in the prayers of the friars and sisters. You are welcome here to find hope for your troubled heart and rest from your labors. You are welcome here to worship God or find him in your questions. You are welcome here to laugh and to cry, to ponder and to marvel. You are welcome just to be here. and we pray that you will always know how loved you are as God's favored child. You are welcome here. The theological simplicity of that welcome message, phrased in basic, relatable human terms, prayer, hope, rest, pondering, love, is characteristic of the public ministry the Servites pursue at the National Sanctuary. The friars avoid language of salvation in their ministry. Instead, they offer to help people increase their quote unquote spiritual well-being. The friars often offers private meetings for those who wish to deepen their spiritual life. And they also offer public talks by Father Richard on subjects like dog spell, the gospel according to dogs. And it doesn't hurt that the gentle Father Richard bears a striking resemblance to R. Crumb's character, Mr. Natural. Every time I see him, I just giggle. But front and center in this ministry is not the Servite fathers, but instead the natural beauty of the grotto grounds and the quietness that pervades here. The Servites are intentional about the spiritual significance, the sanctuary available in quiet and in nature. As the Servites frame the invitation, quote, places of peace, serenity, and spiritual reflection are essential so that people might renew their spirit amid a busy world. And truly, what is striking about the grotto is not the presence of people and statuary, but the absence of human noise. It's hard to adequately describe the soundscape of the gardens. You are close to busy streets and the traffic of Southeast Portland, and yet the dominant sounds at the grotto are the sounds of earth rather than the sounds of human commerce. Raindrops falling through pine branches in winter, frog songs in March, bird chatter on spring mornings, a still silence on sunny summer afternoons, the shushing sounds of the breeze in fading rhododendrons in autumn, the buzzing of insects at twilight. The echo of a siren that occasionally pierces the quiet only serves to remind you that you are surrounded by the city and yet protected in the sanctuary of silence. People seem to innately sense the quiet and match their volume to it, speaking in hushed tones as they say, "Excuse me," to strangers as they exit the elevator on the upper gardens. The Servites clearly understand the power of silence. And here I'm going to motivate this for you. Father Martinez, rector of the grotto grounds, posts a daily walk in the garden on her website, filmed with his camera as he walks before or after public visiting hours. Instead of narrating the botanical content of 1,100 species of flora in the gardens or offering a religious meditation, Father Martinez's daily walks are wordless. He holds the camera and he walks slowly for 2 to 3 minutes through different parts of the grounds each day. Sometimes he pans up into the trees. Sometimes he stops to let the camera linger on a particularly lovely scene. The effect for the viewer is as if you are the one holding the camera. You are the eyes and the feet, and you are silent, immersed in the sounds of nature. I understand after spending countless hours in person at the grotto, the quieting of human noise in this sanctuary, the immersion in silence, reorients visitors from speaking to listening, from projecting one's voice into the world to listening to what exists in the absence of traffic and radios and cell phones, which is nature, and according to the Servites, the voice of God. If silence and sounds of the natural word are partners in the ministry of the Servites, so too is the verdant flora. Portland is located in a temperate rainforest where moist air from the Pacific Ocean hits the Cascade Mountain Range, condenses, and falls as a constant gentle rainfall for 8 months of the year, she says very soggily. We're at the end of the rainy season. These forests are more productive than any other ecosystem on the planet in sheer biomass of living and decaying material. But biomass is such a clinical word to describe the experience of life layered on life, layered on life, and a green so alive in the trees and ferns and moss that it sometimes seems to be glowing. The lower gardens of the grotto are left in their natural state, so the trail through them feels like a walk in the woods. The upper gardens are cultivated, but the human imprint on the landscape is dwarfed, literally, by the towering cedar and pine trees that stand 100 and sometimes 150 feet or more above the landscape. And here I want to give you, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you can see a chapel and a bench. That'll give you a sense of the scale of the trees relative to what's happening at the grotto. Can you see the little red? chapel down at the bottom. In addition to this, statuary and liturgical markers are tucked into moss-covered rock formations and surrounded by ferns and Oregon grape plants. The statues feel like visual counterpoints to the flora rather than a focus unto themselves. Their modesty compared with their surroundings only deepens the sense of being enclosed in a sanctuary of botanical greenness. There's a particular path in the back of the upper gardens that the friars call the Redwood Highway, because it bears the remains of an old forgotten road lined by trees. Father Richard recently gave a meditation called Walking the Redwood Highway, in which he reflected, it's restful, it's beautiful, no matter the weather, and even an awe-inspiring when you look up, 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 only seeing towering trees peak at 100 feet or more. Walking the Redwood Highway as we friars often do, is more than just a walk, it's also a meditation, a thoughtful consideration of our place in the world. Listen up. We're people whose hearts might be in heaven, but our feet are most definitely still on earth. So in conclusion, the grotto embodies one model of how the Catholic Church, and indeed most American religious traditions, might negotiate the challenges of declining religious affiliation in the contemporary US by connecting people to the spirituality of the natural world. But for our panel today, I want to say that my approach to nature in this paper, approaching it as a phenomenological zone for religious experience and a partner to the Servite Fathers in their ministry, might offer us one useful way to discuss nature in religious studies without reducing and objectifying it in a definition.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to all of you for these wonderful presentations. We are nearly at the end of the hour. We can probably go 2 or 3 minutes over, but we have had one question posed in the Q&A, and this is for Brett and Chip, and it's from Dana Logan. And the question is Brett's account of evangelicals experiencing presence through nature in conflict with Chip's account of evangelicals experiencing nature as the medium of civilization? And I think that is an interesting question because it does point out some common tensions that we might identify in all of these papers. So I don't know whether either of you would like to say something to that.
You want to start, Chip?
Sure. I think I have to give that more thought. I hadn't really thought about evangelicals experiencing nature as the medium of civilization in exactly those terms. But I don't think there's a conflict there. I think one thing I'm trying to point to is, first of all, I'm not as concerned with getting at, in what I was trying to do here, what evangelicals in the 19th century were thinking, but more thinking about how we as religious studies scholars might treat that. But I see, like Brett's flea example, an evangelical might contemplate God and human purpose or order or something through the flea bites and responding to the irritations of a flea. But that's kind of my point, is that it's abstract. It's got nothing to do with the flea, really. And there's no relationship of understanding the flea's being other than the flea as an occasion for reflecting on this abstraction of God. And so I'm kind of interested in how we, even in America today is where I'm coming from, and even looking back at the history of this, how we conceal our relationship to the so-called natural world, but the fact that our way of life depends upon resource extractions, which we then conceal and obscure through both secular and religious narratives, and act as if we exist independently somehow of that. I'm kind of interested in that material relation there.
Brett, did you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Chip that I don't see a necessary opposition there. I mean, as I said in my talk, I'm interested in oscillating tensions here. And so for me, the sacramental and the instrumental, they're really two sides of the same coin. They don't exist in exclusion from one another. And a really great example of that is, Joseph Smith has his first vision in Palmyra, right? In what Mormons now call the Sacred Grove, where he has a vision of God, and Jesus. And and this is the pilgrimage site, right, for Mormons today. A side note to that is that after his vision, the family probably mostly timbered the grove, so all the trees there have grown up later, right? So it was a sacred grove at the time, and that did not limit them from also seeing it as a site of instrumental, advancement of civilization. That both of those were in some ways the outworking of God's desires for humanity. So yeah, I'd stop there.
I'd also like to share a comment from Jennifer Graber, and she says to Amy Collinger, would you please repeat that very last sentence, something like, and I wrote it down too, actually, so I can confirm this wording here: nature as a phenomenological zone for religious experience. Jennifer Graber says, I found that a very striking way to think about the non-human world. Thank you. I think, Amy, you produced a definition in spite of your intentions not to, that nature as a phenomenological zone for religious experience. I like that. That's about as encompassing, I think, as we might be able to derive from this session. I mean, I think they're all, as I said earlier, I think there are other themes that we could discuss if we had more time. I mean, one is the question of exploitation of nature. In some sense, you could identify different kinds of exploitation in all of these stories, even Amy, yours too. I mean, in the sense that nature is being used to market a new kind of spirituality that melds better with the spirituality of the West for this Catholic order. But I do want to respect the society's wishes that we end on time. So what I would urge all listeners to do is to engage these presenters via email or other ways now that you know something about the projects that they're working on, because these are all going to be dynamite books when they come out, as I hope you've been able to see. Jennifer Graber has one more comment. She says, I see this as a way to avoid the problematic ways of discussing Native Americans' interactions with the non-human world. Again, going back to that comment by Amy about nature as a phenomenological zone for religious experience. Well, thank you all, and sorry to have to cut it off now, but thank you, Mike, especially for conceiving this and organizing it and inviting me to share it.
Yeah, thank you for chairing, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, all of you.